Welcome, everyone. Akei. My name is Dylan Robbins, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University. I want to start things off this afternoon by acknowledging that our center rests on indigenous Lenape homeland. And as we gather in this virtual space, we ask you to join us in acknowledging the Lenape community, elders both past and present, as well as future generations. We also want to welcome all of you, along with our distinguished guests, Gabrielle Apollon of the New York NYU School of Law's Global Justice Clinic, as well as Emmanuela Douyon, the Executive Director of Policité, and Ralph Thomassaint Joseph, Editor-in-Chief of Ayibopost. As well as extend a very special thanks to Wynnie Lamour of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for moderating this afternoon's discussion, Haitian Migration Beyond the News Cycle, a virtual teach-in. As a federally funded National Resource Center, among CLACS's different roles and mandates, the center is dedicated to hosting and supporting the study and teaching of what Wynnie has referred to in conversation to me as historically undervalued languages, as well as the peoples that speak them, including indigenous and diasporic languages like Quechua, Nahua, Mixteco, and Creole, which has been offered as academic courses at NYU since Wynnie Lamour first joined the center in 2015. And indeed, Haiti and Haitian culture has been a recurring theme among events hosted by CLACS over the years, including a number of spectacular and especially popular events organized by Lamour, including the Mother Tongues United series, the Santé Belair Women's Empowerment series, and an interesting series of Haitian tea parties. Recent events involving the movement of Haitians to and through different parts of Latin America, including especially the grotesque photos of Haitian migrants being chased by mounted police at the political boundary between Texas and Mexico, have been highlighted in mainstream journalism and resonate with a much longer and wider history of Haitian migration in the Americas. This afternoon's teach-in, as with CLACS's previous discussions last spring, for example, on Colombia, or in the year before that on events in Brazil, seeks to bring together expertise and insight to dialogue on emergent circumstances. Before getting started and before passing things off to Wynnie Lamour, I would like to acknowledge the different supporters that have made this afternoon's event possible, including the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora at NYU, the Haitian Creole Language Institute of New York, NACLA, NYU School of Law's Global Justice Clinics, Latinx Law Students Association, Black Allied Law Students Association, and the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics. I want to give a very special thanks to Wynnie Lamour for her efforts in organizing this discussion. And last but not least, a very bittersweet yet warm thank you to the Assistant Director, Omar Daware, right? Omar has been with CLACS since the fall of 2014. And he has organized and participated in the more than 600 events since joining CLACS. And as some of you already know, or if you don't, you're about to, Omar is about to move to New Orleans in the coming days. And this is exactly his last day with CLACS. And this is exactly the last event that he will be with us for as an organizer and as a kind of producer. And so I just wanted to, without distracting from the really important conversation that we're about to have this afternoon, take a moment to recognize Omar and to express the gratitude, mine and that as well of the members of the center, for all of your amazing work and creativity over the years. And just to say how wonderful it is to have been working with you all this time and how appreciative we are for your continued dedication and clear, investment and putting together events just like this teach-in, ones that seek to respond to critical things that are taking place right around us. So thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon, and thanks again to all of our participants, and just wanted to give that thank you as well and recognition to Omar. Thank you. now I'm going to pass off to Wynnie Lamour.
Thank you so much, Dylan. Merci en pile. And also a great thank you to Omar too. Omar, you will definitely be missed for sure. So thank you so much to everyone who's here with us today. Welcome to Haitian Migration Beyond the News Cycle of Virtual Teaching. We're so excited to have you here to be learning together and providing you with really great information on how you can be involved and understand better what's happening in Haiti, both on the ground and in the diaspora. We have three amazing panelists with us today, and I'm just going to go through their bios really quickly so that you know who's joining us today and who you'll be learning from. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to Gabrielle, who's going to be starting off the conversation for us. So Gabrielle Apollon is a supervising attorney and co-director of Haiti Justice and International Accountability Project at NYU School of Law's Global Justice Clinic. Gabrielle previously served as managing attorney at the Door, a center for alternatives, where she represented young people in immigration and family law matters. A 2015 graduate of NYU School of Law, Gabrielle was an Anne Bryce Scholar and a student advocate in the Global Justice and Children Rights Clinics. While in law school, Gabrielle received a Ford Foundation Public Interest Law Fellowship to work with Conectas, a Brazilian human rights organization documenting human rights violations of Haitian migrants en route to Brazil. Prior to law school, Gabrielle worked at the United Nations Office of the Special Envoy to Haiti as a research specialist. She holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University. Yon femme jam, okay? Bon, nous gen avec nous, we also have with us Emmanuela Douyon. Emmanuela is a Haitian development policy and project specialist, activist, op-ed writer, and speaker. She is the executive director of Policité, a consulting firm and think tank that focuses on economic development. She is a member of Nous Pas Dormi, which translates to We Will Not Sleep, a collective of young Haitians committed to influencing how the Haitian state serves the population and fighting corruption, impunity, and social injustice. Emmanuela earned a master's in development studies from Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, a BA in economics from National Tsinghua University in Taiwan, and her work and activism aim to contribute to social justice and economic development in Haiti. Yon lot femme jam ki avec nous aswea. Et puis nous gentou, we also have Ralph Thomassaint Joseph. Ralph is an award-winning multimedia journalist based currently in New York. He's been working as a journalist for more than 10 years. Originally from Haiti, he co-created the news section of Ayibopost, one of the most competitive Haitian digital media, where he's been editor-in-chief for 3 years. He has a master's degree in digital journalism from New York University and studied law and sociology at the Haitian State University. He's also a member of the National Association of Black Journalists. He speaks French, Creole, and English. So thank you so much to everyone who's here, all the panelists. I'm so excited to get the conversation started. I'm going to pass the mic over to Gabrielle, who's going to walk us through a little bit of background so that we're better situating our conversation today. Merci, Gabrielle.
Thank you so much, Wynnie. I'm honored to be one of the panelists today, especially alongside Emmanuela and Ralph, who've been doing such tremendous work in Haiti for years. Thank you to CLACS for organizing and all of the co-sponsors today. I'm really glad that we're delving into the context that precipitated what we saw in Del Rio during this event, the context in Haiti, the context in terms of U.S. foreign policy towards Haiti, as well as the broader migration context, which will be what I'll be delving into. Because although the situation burst into the public eye in September of this year, seemingly from out of nowhere, I know that this recent migration pattern and recent migratory developments that have brought Haitians to the US-Mexico border have been 10 years in the making at the very least. And so while I'm going to focus on the past 10 years, I do want to give a snapshot of the broader context of what these migration patterns from Haiti traditionally looked like, because historically, the vast majority of Haitian immigrants were going to the US, Canada, and the Dominican Republic. And In terms of the US, Haitian immigration started in significant numbers in the 60s and 70s as Haitians fled the brutal regime of the dictator François Duvalier. I won't be going into a ton of the history, but I do think it's important to touch a bit on it because it's critical to understand that what happened in Del Rio in September is unfortunately just the most recent example of a long history of racist US migration policy towards Haitians. So as Dylan mentioned, we saw CBP officials terrorizing Haitian migrants on horseback, but we also saw the accelerated deportations and prioritization of Haitians amongst everybody else, a deportation blitz that is one of the largest and fastest mass deportations that the US has ever conducted. And that was just a continuation of this singling out of Haitians for particularly draconian immigration policies. So again, don't have enough time to go into the full history, but I do want to note some of these consistently draconian policies that we have put in place in the past, because they actually impact our immigration system today in significant ways. For example, the mandatory immigration detention policies that we imposed actually during that first influx of Haitian migration in the 70s and 80s, that actually birthed our current mass immigration detention system. There was a significant increase in building immigration detention facilities as well, and that the specific and explicit impetus was to detain Haitians at the time. That's not to mention the Haitians that we detained in Guantanamo, up to 12,000 in the 1990s, not to mention the interdiction at sea policies that we created specifically to detain and send Haitians back in the midst of coups and just atrocious human rights violations occurring. But at every point, and at each point that I've mentioned, the US has mostly refused to recognize Haitians as having valid claims for political asylum and solely painting them as economic refugees, even while, as Ralph and Emmanuela will describe in detail, the US has been deeply involved in creating and perpetuating the political conditions and crises that have in fact caused people to flee. And I think it's important to touch on that history, even though I don't have a lot of time, because the anti-Black racism and discrimination that influenced those policies, that remains to this day. And I think we saw that very clearly in September, and unfortunately continue to see that. And this tweet that I flagged here is because this has effectively been our position towards Haitians for a very long time. But this is from March 24th of this year, when the U.S. Embassy thought it was appropriate to flag and translate into Creole a saying that says, "I'm saying clearly, don't come, do not come here." And that is the same message that we've proceeded and continued to send, even in light of increasingly terrible conditions that the U.S. has had a part to play in. So next slide, please. So in light of that context, I do want to zero in on what migration has looked like since 2010, since it has drastically shifted. In January of 2010, there was a 7.0 magnitude earthquake, which many of you know, that killed an estimated over 200,000 people and decimated the country's capital, Port-au-Prince. And if that's not terrible enough, there was an extraordinary misuse of funds that were meant for reconstruction. And so very little of the billions of dollars that were raised actually made it to Haitian people, instead going to NGOs and contractors based in the global north. So I know that my panelists will talk a little bit more about that, but that is the context in which things started to dramatically shift in terms of migration. Over the years, it's become increasingly hard for people from Haiti to immigrate to the US in light of so many of the policies that I mentioned. But basically, after the earthquake, Haitians started leaving in large numbers to wherever they could go. And so for the first time, we have tens of thousands of Haitians beginning to immigrate to South America, primarily Brazil at first. And these are countries that had no significant Haitian populations before this. And this was starting in late 2010 and early 2011. And many of the people had heard that there would be work opportunities in light of, the fact that the World Cup and the Olympics were occurring in Brazil, and that there was a need for construction of stadiums and such. And so this started this journey, but unfortunately these journeys were extremely precarious. As you can see from this map, these are really circuitous journeys. They were thousands of miles long and they could take months. Often this is just one trajectory, but the one that you see here, people would often go into the DR and fly to Panama, and then take another flight to Ecuador, and then often do the rest of that journey via bus, car, boat sometimes, or by foot. It included trekking through the Amazon often. And as Wynnie mentioned, I was in Brazil in 2012 interviewing Haitian migrants, and I would say so many, if not all, spoke about this journey and talked about just the significant abuse and extortion that they experienced, not just from smugglers or coyotes, but also from government authorities and political and police in these various countries. And they reported significant physical and sexual abuse, as well as theft and a myriad of other abuses. And so, but we're talking about a massive scale of migration, because by 2014, there were about 50,000 Haitians in Brazil. And by 2018, there were over 150,000. And I think another thing that's striking is that there were between, about 10, 11 years ago, there have actually been several waves of migration since then. So, I think there have been approximately 3, if not 4. The second wave of migration was in fact towards Chile. So after Brazil's economy started taking a downturn in around 2014, and it became more challenging for people to find work, not just because of the downturn, but because of discrimination that Haitians have reported, in employment, as well as, violent attacks, people started going into Chile. And so just to give a few numbers again, in 2014, there were approximately 1,800 migrants in Chile. 5 years later, there were about 185,000 Haitians. And by the end of 2019, they were the 3rd highest immigrant population in Chile. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see how so many migration routes have proliferated over that decade, and you'll get a sense of the numbers, because people were traveling from Brazil to Chile, from Haiti to Chile, and then about 2 years later, people start taking a similar journey from Brazil and Chile all the way back up north into Mexico to get to the US-Mexico border. And so, when people were first talking about Del Rio, I think a question I heard a lot was, how in the world did people from Haiti get to the US-Mexico border? And so this is the beginning of that, or I guess the second or third part of that journey, in which people who've already made it to Brazil and Chile are trekking back up through Central and South America to get, through the Darien Gap, which is a 66-mile long jungle that separates Colombia and Panama and is notoriously dangerous, and crossing through 8 to 10 borders. And it usually would take, 2 to 3 months for this journey. That's how people were getting into Mexico and up to the US-Mexico border. And so just to give a sense again about how many people were getting into Mexico, and the fact that this is not something that occurred yesterday. There were a few hundred Haitians in Mexico up until 2014, and by 2018, there were approximately 4,000 Haitian immigrants in Tijuana. And by 2016, Haitian migrants made up 80% of migrants in Tijuana. And so I'm not going to be able to get into a ton about the conditions in Mexico at this point, but I think what's important is you see an influx into Mexico in 2016, 2017. At first, Haitians were being paroled in, and then in response to this influx in Haitians, the U.S. under Obama changed its policy. And so Haitians were then being, and I'll get into this a little later, metered or turned away from the border and weren't able to actually request asylum, and were being asked to come back days later. And so that you're seeing this since 2016, 2017, but in 2020 and 2021, as conditions are continuing to deteriorate for Haitians during the pandemic in Chile and Brazil, you do see an additional increase in numbers of people taking that journey to get to the U.S.-Mexico border. But one reason I think it's critical to have a sense of what these migration journeys have entailed is because of the role that we see that anti-Blackness plays throughout these journeys, because many Haitians report that discrimination and racism in these other countries, in Brazil and Chile, did contribute to their continued migration to travel to the US-Mexico border. If you could go to the next slide, please. I think this quote is important. This is from a Chilean professor, because she highlights the compounded vulnerability that Haitians have experienced in some of these new destination countries. It's not just that they don't speak Spanish, and that makes access to services and availability of translation challenging, but there's also a separate additional barrier, and one that often rears its head first, which is racial prejudice. We know that so many of these countries, not just the US, but so many of these countries have legacies of colonialism and colorism and slavery, and that is impacting as well Haitians' experience in these various places. I'm not going to get into it again a ton, but I will give a few examples. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Some of the experiences that Haitians report in Brazil and Chile range from discrimination in employment and access to services like medical care and education to actual physical attacks and violence. So in 2015, in Sao Paulo, there were 2 attacks of groups where Haitian migrants were actually shot at. And the assailants specifically identified them as Haitian and yelled that they were taking their jobs. Those Haitians then, when they did go to the hospital, had difficulty accessing medical services, in part due to their status and what they looked like. That's just one example in Brazil. CGRS, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, has just a tremendous compilation of country conditions that really, goes into a lot of detail of what people were experiencing. Some of the, racist caricatures, which you can see here, that have been, found in Chile, I find they resemble caricatures that were done of Black people in the US in the 1900s. And I think that it's important to talk about this, because I think that sometimes people would talk about, Haitians were not refugees, Haitians were not fleeing circumstances. They didn't come straight from Haiti. They were in Chile, they were in Brazil for a while beforehand. These are some of the things I heard in responses to Del Rio, but yet people do not take these thousands of miles journeys if they're not things that they are fleeing. And I think there's not as much research and documentation, unfortunately, and publicity about what people had been facing in Chile and in Brazil, as there should be. And unfortunately, due to COVID, there was an additional layer of stigmatization and marginalization that Haitian communities, particularly in Chile, faced as well. So I know my time is short, so I'm gonna keep going, but one of the things that I think is important is we have to understand those trajectories and journeys, apologies for the sirens, that people took to get to the US-Mexico border, to show to really be able to recognize how unjust and inhumane the US response to the people arriving in Del Rio were, because these are people who have taken these extraordinarily long journeys, many with small children who've arrived dehydrated, at the very least, and extraordinarily vulnerable. And instead of treating it as a humanitarian situation, we sought to prioritize deportation resources. We sought to prioritize fast tracking people into a situation which Ralph and Emmanuela will discuss in great detail, that has only become, unfortunately, worse shortly after the earthquake in August and shortly after the presidential assassination. Again, they will talk about that more, but I do want to flag that since September 19th, we have expelled close to 8,800 people to Haiti. And that's approximately 44% were women and children. And this is, unfortunately, again, just the latest example of our draconian policies towards Haitians. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to pass it on to Ralph.
Now we're going to invite Ralph to come up to the stage and
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here. And thank you for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure for me to talk about my country, Haiti, a country I love and adore so much, a beautiful country with one of the most beautiful histories in the world. So 2 months ago, I was in Del Rio, Texas, to cover the migrant crisis when thousands of people, mostly Haitians, they were parked under a bridge in the hope of entering the U.S. territory to enjoy their bit, maybe, of the American dream. So when I was in Del Rio, many people were asking one question. So why now? Why now so many Haitians are coming to the US? So there were many answers, and I think that Gabrielle picked some of them. And some of the reasons were these people were fleeing violence after the assassination of the president and the control of the country by the gangs. There is the impact of the fake news circulating through social media saying that the Biden administration was welcoming asylum seekers. There's a lack of opportunities in Latin America since many Haitians live in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile for years. So as a result, many of them crossed the many countries to reach the US-Mexico borders. So as Gabrielle portrayed it, many died during the journey. Many women were raped. I had interviews of women who witnessed rape. Women gave births and died on the road. Haitians, they were exploited by armed gangs during the trips, but they braved the danger so they could be here in the US seeking better living conditions. But there is another answer that many people don't really pay attention to. What happened in Del Rio, Texas is the consequence of the US policy in Haiti. In a piece I had written, published in El Paso Times, I had mentioned that to avoid the next wave of Haitian migration, which I think will be more significant, the US must review its policy in Haiti. So some may say that it's always easy to put the blame on others, which is not my intention. But I think that we must go back a bit in history to understand how US policy has affected Haiti for centuries. Here are some examples to understand. When the Selma to Montgomery marches were happening in the United States in 1965, Haiti was already a 161-year independent Black nation. When Black people could not sit in the same seat or go to the same restrooms as white people in the US, Haiti was already a century-old Black independent country in the world. So the first Black republic in the world that defeated the most powerful army in 1803, Haiti won its independence by defeating a coalition of powerful colonial Western white country to claim the thing that hurt the most Western interests at the time, freedom and the end of slavery. So while the US was applying the Jim Crow, the redlining, and systemic racism, its troops were invading Haiti in 1915 to restore, as you know, the old mantra, democratic order. When the Tulsa massacre took place in 1921, the white US soldiers were already occupying Haiti for 6 years. But we must ask ourselves, how couldn't the US be racist toward the first Black republic in the world at that time? And I think that this question is still relevant today. How can the US not be racist when it cannot solve its racism problem internally? So I think that we cannot understand US policy in Haiti without the prism of racism. So when Haiti became independent in 1804, Haiti was outcasted because it symbolized the negation of the world order. Haiti had to remain unstable and poor because it couldn't be a success story for other Black people who were slaves. Haiti had to be poor and unstable because A well-functioning country governed by Black people, prospering financially and intellectually, could represent a terrible counter-narrative to the white Western civilization. So Haiti was part of that strategy of well-crafted narrative that portrays Black people as savages, incapable of civilization, and therefore incapable of governing themselves. That is why, after its independence, Haiti strove to pay France what historians call the double debt of independence until after World War II. Haiti had to condemn its citizens to poverty to pay for its independence. And Haiti has always been described as poor, unstable country of Black people incapable of governing themselves. But the truth is, Haiti has been impoverished. Internal racism and colorism combined with international racism are some of the main reasons why the Haitian situation is so complex now. As of today, wealth and privileges in Haiti are about color and foreign citizenship. The wealthiest are light-skinned and white foreign people, while the vast majority are poor and Black, are the poor Black people. There are some other key facts to understand the situation, the migrant crisis, and the political quagmire in Haiti. Remember, the US military invaded Haiti in 1905, in 1915, to occupy the country for 19 years. The US military came back in 1994, and the US peacekeeping mission came in 2004. In 2010, we had a terrible earthquake that killed tens of thousands and severely damaged the country already fragile infrastructure. Then the UN soldiers introduced a deadly variant of cholera, then hurricanes, floods, and many other catastrophes. So what we call the international community in Haiti, which in Haiti always referred to the United States, decides who is to be president and who is not to be. The international community / United States organize many selection exercises they call election. So we must look at the migration crisis as a consequence of the US policy in Haiti. The country faced the last 4 years its biggest financial scandal under an administration installed by the United States. American guns are killing hundreds of Haitians every year. So the current crisis in Haiti is an occasion for the US to question its policy seriously. Otherwise, there will be many real crises to come. So when it comes to Haiti, there are so many things we can say. There is the way that the press cover the Haitian crisis, and that narrative, about Black people who can still govern themselves, that is speak continuously. So I know that there will be discussion. I'm stopping there and pass the mic to Emmanuela Douyon. Thank you.
Merci en pile, Ralph. Bon, Emmanuela.
Thank you, Wynnie. Thank you for having me today. Thank you for organizing this event on this critical topic. I also want to thank my fellow panelists for the input. It is really my pleasure to join this conversation. In the past years, the other more urgent and pressing issues affecting the people of Haiti shift our attention from an ongoing migration crisis, like Mrs. Apollon mentioned it in her presentation. I'm not going back to this description, but it really shows how this crisis evolved. And it started in the years after the earthquake and intensified around 2017 and 2018. Way before the Haitian refugees went to Del Rio, Haitians left Haiti to go to Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. Economic, social, and political motives can explain why Haitians flee their country. And considering the nature of Haitian migration in the past years and the type of destination they have chosen, we can assume that the push factors outweigh the pull factors. And this is why it is very important to talk about the context on the ground in Haiti. Haitian refugees and asylum seekers are fleeing a country led by an ineffective government where massacres and repression occurs from time to time. They are people who had to endure crippling violence, political instability, and the absence of opportunities to thrive in dignity. And Haiti has been in the news for many reasons as the country is facing a multifaceted crisis. In more detail, we can talk about the political crisis. And on the political level, what we observe is a political deadlock, a vacuum in power following the assassination of former President Jovenel Moïse, and difficulty among key political actors and civil society to reach a large consensus to solve the political crisis. The economy of Haiti is suffering from 3 consecutive years of negative economic growth. The people are becoming poor as we registered record inflation rate in the past years. And other aspects include a deterioration in the security situation and increased gang violence. And one of the victims is former President Jovenel Moïse, who was assassinated in his house, in his home last July. Gangs have become like so powerful that they control large part of the territory. There is also a humanitarian crisis following the displacement of people fleeing gang violence in Thomassaint. There is an increase in the number of people in food insecurity, and a 7.2 magnitude earthquake devastated the southern part of the country last August. And in the midst of all of this, since 2018, Haitians have been asking for accountability and a trial on the mismanagement of a development fund, the Petro-Caribe Fund. This fund was supposed to be used on some major development projects, but there is not much to show years after. We do not know what they did with this money, but we know for sure that they didn't complete most of the projects. Some of them, they didn't even start them. And despite the size of this movement and the fact that so many people were involved and it lasted a few years, this didn't lead to, it didn't result in any arrest. No individual has been arrested based on the implication in the mismanagement of the Petro-Caribe Fund. And what we observe is that there is a weak political and socio-economic system in Haiti that can no longer renew itself. And it's really hard for people to feel safe in Haiti and imagine a future at home. This is the situation that is pushing them away. I look forward to your question. I don't know what to use most of the time. It will be my pleasure to answer any questions that you may have.
Merci en pile, Emmanuela. Thank you so much, Emmanuela.
Thanks.
I had a set of questions I wanted to ask y'all, but as you all were speaking and presenting, there were other thoughts that popped into my mind. But first, I want to thank you all, Gabrielle, Raf, Emmanuela, for your input. It's important that we contextualize our conversation. I know that there are a lot of folks, as Gabrielle mentioned earlier, who are confused, like how did Haitian people even get to the Texas border? There are a lot of people who are curious about the movement of Haitian people to South America. As you all mentioned in several ways, there have been several policies that have led to Haitian people migrating to other spaces, or as Emmanuela mentioned just now, there are more push factors than pull factors. And I want to start our conversation on the ground. Emmanuela, you mentioned very briefly the Petro-Caribe scandal. I'd like to know, can you share more with us how young people on the ground were using social media to lead a campaign around the Code Petro-Caribe, and what has that led to in terms of the impact on the lives of Haitian people on the ground. And I asked this question particularly to you, Emmanuela, because I know that you are on the ground. Me, I'm a diaspora. C'est dans le journal, moi, dans des nouvelles, yo, c'est là, les familles dans des nouvelles, comprennent pas là. So as a diaspora, I'm always looking to hear about what are young people, like my young counterparts in Haiti, what's happening there, and how are y'all using social media to drive that work?
Okay, thank you, Wynnie. Back in 2018, I think the life of a lot of young Haitian made me change when we started asking one question together. It's called Petro Caribbean in Creole. It will be, where is the Petro Caribbean money in English? And this was a tagline that later became the label of the most significant social movement for accountability and systemic change in Haiti. And this movement for accountability was led by many civil society, grassroots organization like NUPAP Domi. And since 2018, we've been literally asking for a trial and on the Petro-Caribe case, because Venezuela gave us the chance to get oil at a discounted price. And we were supposed to use, Haiti was supposed to use that money to fund development project, but the official, they mismanaged that money. And therefore, back in 2018, we started asking for accountability on this. And this strong citizen mobilization has forced the Court of Auditors to publish several highly worrisome reports on the waste and misappropriation of billions of dollars from the Petro-Caribe Fund. And former President Jovenel Moïse was named toward the court's audit report. Before he became president, he managed part of this money, and he was supposed to realize projects that were not completed. And he was decried by the majority of the population. And because he was involved in the Petro-Caribe scandal, we asked him to resign and be held accountable before a judicial system. But there has been no real government corruption investigation or prosecution despite years of peaceful demonstration and continuous call from civil society and political actors. Now the political crisis gets so bad that, and the deterioration in the security situation is so bad that it's hard for us to keep asking for a Petro-Caribe trial, because now we are asking for the right to live, because they are kidnapping people and people are dying every day. And this happened also because since the Haitians started asking for the Petro-Caribe money, there were people who were trying to terrorize the population. We had a massacre occurred in La Saline because they wanted to stop people from joining the protests, and they probably had other motives, but one of them was this, because people from the La Saline neighborhood were always involved, and many of them came to the protest. And there is a link with this call for accountability and the fact that Haiti now become a country where gangs are so powerful, because it was kind of a strategy to intimidate people so that they will not be joining protests and all. And now we have the very complicated crisis that we have, and we cannot even ask for the Petro-Caribe money, because we have to ask for like the right to live in our country and not being kidnapped and all.
It's always so hard to hear the reality of what's happening on the ground, especially given that folks don't want to be leaving their home, right? You mentioned, all of you mentioned that in different ways. Haitian people don't want to go to a country where they're dealing with, global anti-Blackness, or a country where they don't speak the language, where they don't have family. No one wants to trek through the Amazon forest for months, trying to get to a space where they can survive. So I always ask myself the next question. I always ask myself, well, then what's next? Well, if okay, you had this really great campaign called Pito Caribea, which brought people's attention to it, because honestly, I didn't know about the Pito Caribe before the social media campaign that y'all launched on the ground. You know, what's next in terms of actually getting to a space where we could see some change? But I feel like that's probably the last question we should ask ourselves. What I want to hear now, specifically from Ralph, is what role has Haitian media played in countering the narrative of what's presented about Haiti in the United States? And I'm asking this particularly because we're here. The title of our workshop is Haitian Migration Beyond the News Cycle. So what does it look like for Haitians on the ground when they hear about, for example, what happened in Del Rio, or when the Petro Caribea campaign was launched on social media? What messages are people receiving on the ground about?
Okay, there are many things to consider. Haiti is facing a huge crisis, and the crisis is not just about the political sector. It's the crisis is about the civil society, the lack of organization. When you have a country where so many people are leaving every year, so there's a kind of um, disorganization. So, you know, the crisis touches the press too, because there is not a unique way to see how the coverage must be about corruption or about the migrant crisis. The press is also part of the corruption because the press backed, you know, the political sector and the mafia that is in the private sector. One of the reasons why it's so hard to address the Petrocaribe scandal, it's because it's a huge corruption scheme that involves people in the political sector and in the private slash financial sector. I mean, the business people, the most powerful people. So that's the reason why they did everything to shut down the protests. So there's something I've discovered here in the United States about the coverage of the what they call the migrant crisis. There are things about the migrants that are newsworthy here in the US. For example, hundreds of migrants are coming to the US border. It's a news here in the United States. But it's not newsworthy in Haiti to say that Haitians are leaving the country, since Haitians know that, you know, we have to leave the country because we can't withstand the reality of the situation. When people have gangs controlling the main area, the main roads, when people are hearing or witnessing or being victim of rape or violence, or when people have their home taken with guns. So leaving the country is not, you know, newsworthy. So I think one of the things that was striking in Del Rio, it was maybe the first time that Haitians in Haiti could see that huge number of their country people packed under that bridge. I think the fact that the white man on the horse whipping Haitians, it was a very striking image. And frankly, people were expecting more news on, is it possible for us to come after that, rather than, you know, will these people I don't know, it's not just the news, because many people knew for months that many Haitians were leaving Latin America to come to the United States, because what we saw in Del Rio was a thing happening for months, even for years. So many Haitians were leaving Latin America, so it was not newsworthy. And there is another problem. Haiti is a country stricken with poverty, so it's pretty hard for Haitian media to cover what happened here in the US. So basically, we cannot have a news correspondent coming here in the US because of the cost, because of, you know, everything. So there is something very interesting that happened in Del Rio. When I went there, I was the only, Haitian journalist. So I made a call on the social platform for other Haitian journalists based here in the US to go there to cover the story and to tell the narrative our way. So after that, I seen many people with specialized platform. They went there in Texas trying to explain to the Haitian audience what's going on and what they have to do. So thanks to the way that they covered the crisis, many people, beside the Haitian Bridge Alliance, which was the only Haitian/Black organization that was there to help people. So after the media coverage here, many people, many organization, lawyers there went to Texas to help their country people. So to go back to the question, it's a bit hard because, the press in Haiti, the press based in Haiti can't not really cover the situation for mostly financial reason. And here, due to the fact that we have a couple of Haitian in diaspora running some news outlet, that were able to report what was going on in Del Rio.
This is a heavy. This is always so heavy for me, honestly. And I as a diaspora always feel and I want to make it clear though that as diaspora, I know that we can't center our feelings in this because we're not on the ground, and we're not experiencing this firsthand in Haiti. But I always ask myself and others, especially folks like Ralph and Emmanuela, who are coming straight from Haiti, who are literally at the front lines in Haiti. I always ask, what are things that folks who are interested in also being on the front lines in some way, what are some things that we can do to get involved to create some sort of impactful or sustainable change in Haiti? And this is a big question. I know this asking it, and I also know that there isn't one particular response. But I am curious to hear from all of you. What are some steps that we can take to combat what's happening, while also knowing that we need to create a systemic change long term? I am very clear about this, and I know that there are many folks who are clear about this too. But Gabrielle, Emmanuela, Ralph, where do you think we could start as folks who want to get involved?
As this is terrible, I think, for a diaspora to start talking. So I'm going to be very, very brief since I'm going to speak first. But I think what you said, Wynnie, is so important, that as members of the Haitian diaspora, that we are first listening to Haitians in Haiti, Haitian civil society, people like Emmanuela and Ralph, who are so involved and integral. And to just, as a brief aside though, as the thing that gives me the hope and encouragement is seeing all of the work that Emmanuela and Nupapdomi, and the work that Ralph and Ayibopost, the work that people are doing in the most challenging circumstances, and continuing to fight, is what is so encouraging. And so that's why I think it's so important to first look to them and to first listen to what they're calling us to do as hopefully allies, as opposed to what often happens, unfortunately, is the diaspora thinks that their ideas are sometimes the right ones or the more important ones. And I think I'm going to stop talking now and pivot, because I would love to hear from you all.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle. I don't know if Ralph want to add, but what I realized from my experience as an activist is that many allies who are in the US have been able to help our movement in Haiti a lot. And I think that people in the diaspora can do a lot. And if you consider the role that the US play in our politics, like the US-Haitian relationship, this is like the place for Haitian American to act. They can do things that us Haitian living in Haiti cannot do. Or if we do it, it won't be as impactful as if they do it. Like as a Haitian, I don't want the US to interfere in what's going on in Haiti. And I don't want to be commenting too much, or it's not even commenting too much. I cannot tell the US government what to do. I can only speak as a Haitian based on what I feel they are doing that is not white in Haiti. But if they are Asian American, they are American, and they can call their congressman, they can advocate in a way that as a Haitian, I cannot. And also, I think that they can amplify what's going on in Haiti. They can try a way to find ways to collaborate with local organization in Haiti. And I'm sure they have resources that we do not necessarily have in Haiti. And if there are like more people involved, it will be easier for everyone. They can always amplify and reach out to see if they can maybe help translate material in English. There is like so much that people in the diaspora can do. I will let Ralph add. Just
Yeah, it's a very tricky question, and I think that people here in the diaspora like you can do some things and can do some really valuable things. When I was in Del Rio, I was really proud of the people from the Haitian Bridge Alliance. I was really proud. As a Black person, as a Haitian, I could see how their presence was meaningful for our countrymen because they could speak the language, they could understand their country people. This was very important. And this made me realize that one of the things that we need here in the diaspora is more organization from the Haitians, especially people like us, because uh, you can echo what is being talking in Haiti. I mean, the conversation, the the protest, because once you're here, you speak English, you can just amplify, what's going on in Haiti. So policymakers, so I don't know, even people in Washington, powerful people in Washington can, look at the reality in Haiti with another eye. So I think organization is one of the things to consider. And the fact that here in the diaspora, you are able to, have better living conditions compared to many Haitians living in Haiti, be part of the change by really contributing. I know that people in diaspora, they used to send, expensive items for their families, for their girlfriends and boyfriends in Haiti. But when it comes to support the good Haitians organization, um, you know, it's it's not obvious that people in the diaspora do so. So I can talk from the perspective from Ayibopost. I think that when you consider we have a good media that can launch an English section that can cover topics here in the U.S. People in the diaspora, people like you, diaspora, as you define yourself, can be part of that change by contributing. When you have organizations like maybe Pub Domain, human rights organization, don't leave that these organizations are fully supported by international funding, by USAID funding, by I don't know, whatever funding, but try to organize yourself so you can contribute to the sustainable change in Haiti. And I think this is part of my response.
And I think I have one last thing to add, and I'm saying it in a very good way because it might sound weird. One of the things that people in the diaspora can do is to educate themselves about what's going on in Haiti. I'm saying it because there is a huge problem of misinformation and disinformation, and people in the diaspora contribute to worsen it because the people in Haiti trust people in the diaspora to have access in quality information. But unfortunately, it's not always true. There are some news outlets that are doing a good job to report what's going on in Haiti. Let's say Miami Herald or other news channels, news outlet, but there are also a lot of YouTubers who are like, they have their channels and it's always about gossip. The title is catchy, the news become gossip, and they make whatever they want out of what's happening in Haiti, and people trust them because they use music, and they make stories, and they make it sound like though you were watching some reality TV. So people really love, they follow them for entertainment, and they believe them as fact. It is really complicated, and these people have an idea of Haiti and what's happening in Haiti that is so wrong, and people in the diaspora contribute to perpetuate some wrong images or ideas on what's happening in Haiti. And WhatsApp is so popular, it all goes to WhatsApp, and people start making story, and it's hard for everyone.
Maybe one last thing, Winnie, I would love to add. I've met many interesting, people, Haitian people here, and these people, I would like to see them uh, uh, being part of the narrative and the media in Haiti. So I think that Haitians here, especially the young Haitian, must consider that they must build the narrative. I mean, building media, make people in Haiti and here in the diaspora see another kind of Haitian instead of, the continuous, political leaders we see talking in the media all the time. So in Haiti, people would like to see what is your success story, Wynnie? What is your success story, Gabrielle? What can you bring, to Haiti? What your work here? I think this can inspire people to see that, there are Haitians struggling here in the US, there are Haitian making success, but it's not just, a country where people come and there is a tree providing money and they just have to receive money and food from the diaspora. I think that you must consider this guy, be part of the production of the narrative about Haiti. This is really important.
Well, I'm sorry if I don't want to last thing, but I've been here in the US for a few months, following in a few months, and I've met a lot of Haitians. What I noticed is that there is also a group of people of Haitian in the diaspora who need help here. They do not understand what's going on in the US as well. And since we're talking about migration, I think there is a real insertion problem. People come here, they do not speak English, they do not know what to do to find a job, they do not know how to navigate this complicated system. And part of helping Haitians at home is also helping those people to find their way in the system, because one of the best advantage Haitians get when someone else migrate here is that at least they send remittances. And if they are here, they might as well send as much as much money as they can, and they will never be able to do it if they don't know how to live here or to find a job, what kind of advantages they can find here, or protection as a migrant. And I think this is also something very important that we do not talk about it a lot, but I noticed that it is a real problem in some Haitian communities here in the US.
Yeah, and I know you want to get to questions, Wynnie, but I'm sorry, I do have to just add one thing to that point. And I'm so glad you shared that, because I think, as Ralph mentioned, I think there are some great organizations that people can support and volunteer with. And I think it's important to flag those. So obviously, I'm grateful Ralph mentioned Haitian Bridge Alliance. In New York, we have Haitian Women for Haitian Refugees, which has been doing this work for close to 3 decades now. We have, FUM, I see FUM in Miami, and they're, as Emmanuela.
Sotla also in Miami.
Yes. And then there are definitely some in Boston, but I think this is really important, especially because while unfortunately most Haitians in Del Rio were expelled or, quote, voluntarily returned to Mexico, there have been some who were able to enter and be paroled as they are processed through their removal proceedings. And I say processed because that is how we treat people in this country. But it's important because those people do need support and assistance in navigating the immigration system and, you know, finding housing and all of those things. And within the various Haitian communities, I think we really need to support the organizations who are doing this work and get involved. And I have seen, you know, more Haitians in the diaspora in New York do that. I hope we continue to see more. And continue to see like more contributions to these organizations that are doing incredible work.
Thank you so much, Gal, Emmanuela, Gabrielle. You all shared things that I think are so important for us as we continue to figure out what we can do collectively. And I think the key word is collectively. I think that's what we've all landed on, is that there needs to be, as I've said, an aspect of better organization and better understanding, as Emmanuela mentioned, and then Gabrielle, better listening, making sure that we are clear of what the ask is, that we're clear about the information, and that we're clear about where we can move forward together. But again, I have to say that I know that these are all challenging things to do, especially given the experience, the very unique experiences that we all have individually that guide our general outlook in life. The first question is from Nibedita. Nibedita is from India, currently studying Master of Public Policy, and they've been following the Haitian crises closely. And the question is, what are your views on skill development / job creation / entrepreneurship promotion in Haiti that may address the migration problem as well as contribute to economic growth? So I'm thinking particularly, Emmanuela, before when you were mentioning the push and pull elements, and this question is for everyone, what do you think about those tactics as a way to address the migration problem?
I think job creation and promotion of entrepreneurship, like she mentioned, and thank you for the question. I forgot to say this. It's a good one. And I think that job creation, promotion of entrepreneurship could actually help, because not all, some Haitian refugees are of course flying persecution, but some of them are just looking for economic opportunities. Therefore, if we create jobs at home, this might be able to help. My concern is that it's often empty when people say that they are promoting job creation in Haiti, or there are like projects to create job. Is usually some short-term programs, and we don't really see the result. I think honestly what we need is like strong and new and good governance, and the job creation and entrepreneurship promotion need to be part of a bigger plan to develop the country. And this way it can have an impact, but it cannot be some isolated project that some NGOs or donors are going to implement. We've had it before after the earthquake, and years before it didn't work.
Yeah, and I would like to add that, you know, I've seen so many of these small projects pushed by, you know, international organization, you know, funded by the European Union or USAID, but they're not relevant. And I think we must see this, the reality as a whole. You cannot implement small project creating job in Haiti while you're pushing corrupt leaders in the public administration. So we must see Haiti in terms of real development project. I mean, we need to develop a country, and we need to put in place institution. You can create job, but as you know, the country is corrupt, there will always be problems. So I think that we must question the way that people were pushing the small project in Haiti first, and then understand that the political leadership is very important.
I also think, sorry, Wynnie, I also think that we have to talk about the types of jobs that you can, job creation oftentimes, unfortunately, in Haiti has meant people pushing effectively sweatshops to Haiti, and saying, oh, well, it's better than nothing, when really we are contributing to people having very exploitative working conditions. And as Emmanuela mentioned, that did happen after the earthquake, pre-earthquake, after earthquake, and those are harmful, right? And in terms of contextualizing it, these are often U.S. based companies that are benefiting when these products or when these programs are implemented. But that's also in the context of us, the U.S. pushing agricultural policies and agricultural subsidies that harm the agricultural industry in Haiti. And so I think looking at it in a broader perspective of how are U.S. policies contributing to the destruction of Haitian economy is critical as well.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. The next question is from Carlin. Carlin says, thank you for your great presentations. The question is, do you consider the current insecurity situation as it relates to the gangs and fuel shortage will have a larger impact on immigration than previous crises? Although I kind of have a response, but I want to hear what y'all have to say.
My answer will be a definite yes. Because, even after Del Rio, even last week I was watching on Facebook many people on boats trying to reach the US border. So as long as Haiti is poor and unstable, there will be many waves of migration. So in the paper I mentioned during my presentation published in El Paso Times, I mentioned that maybe I can be part of the next wave of migration, because the way that the situation is now in Haiti, with the country completely controlled by the gangs, and the gangs are not only people with guns on poor neighborhoods, but the gangs are inside the government. The gangs are in the private sector, in the business sector. So, no, people cannot live, correctly in this country. There will be many waves of migration as long as Haiti is unstable.
And I agree with Ralph. And what I would like to add is that people can live in Haiti without a job. They can live in Haiti with a political crisis, but it's just unthinkable to stay in Haiti when their life is at risk. And this is what's happening with the gang. Is that that you can die any day, you can be kidnapped any day, and you realize that the gangs are becoming so powerful that they are telling people when they can go on the street, when they have to stay home. It's like Haiti become now a country where the gangs are ruling. And this is really pushing people away. And it's hard for someone who has an opportunity to live to say that I'm staying when they know that their life is at risk. And there are, of course, Haitians that will never leave this country. But for those who are living, this is one of the main reasons. This is worse than living in a country that is in like an economic crisis or political crisis. This is like really dangerous. It's like their life is at stake. It's choosing between death or life for some people living in some areas. I'm talking about Thomassaint or even some part of Delma.
And I think something that Ralph mentioned, and I think Emmanuela previously, that's important to highlight is I think sometimes when people hear gangs in Haiti, they don't really understand how politically connected and how politically motivated this activity is, because, I'm speaking as a former immigration attorney. I think people often are like, oh, gang violence, that I can't really do much with that when it comes to someone's asylum claim. But in fact, Emmanuela mentioned the La Saline massacre in 2018. There's been a Harvard report that the government at the time time was implicated in crimes against humanity because there were very clear links to government officials and that massacre, police officers. Like, this is not just like gangs just out there doing whatever they want. Like, a lot of these gang attacks are motivated politically and financed, and there's so much of a connection that I think is critical, and specifically a connection to governments that the U.S. continue to prop up after, as Emmanuela said, thousands and thousands of people were in the streets for months and close to years saying that this was untenable, that this is an unacceptable situation, and that situation was continued to be pushed onto them and propped up to them. And I'll stop there. But I think that's a really important component to remember as we talk about the kidnappings, as we talk about the gang violence.
Also, some folks asked about the organizations that were mentioned earlier. Thank you, Gabrielle. You put a very great list of organizations there. So for those of you who are looking for that, Evans Jean-Pierre says, what should the new approach, this is a large question, but what should the new approach to US-Haiti relationship be policy-wise? What should that new engagement look like, and who in Haiti should it involve? Ça sont belles questions, mais nous pas répondre really fully, but if you want to take a stab at it, I think even I'm curious to hear from all of you what you think that could look like.
Emma, you want to go first, no?
Feel free to go first.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I've been thinking about this for years, since I've been in college in Haiti. This is a constant conversation. I had published a thread on Twitter a couple of months ago where I addressed this question, and this is my opinion. I think that one of the things that the US must consider if it wants to question its policy in Haiti is to question its representative in Haiti. I mean, you have people representing US interests in Haiti for decades, what they are doing. I think this is really important because there is an intricate connection, an intimate connection between, I mentioned in my presentation that the wealth in Haiti is in the hands of light-skinned / white people. So there's a connection between the foreign envoys in Haiti with that white elites that exert racism toward Black people in Haiti. This is very important because Haitians are facing internal and international racism / colorism. This is really important. So there is a connection between these people from the private sector when you see that they're, foreign aid, foreign support from organization, from institution like USAID or European Union. The contract go to the rich people. The foreign representative, they send their kids to the same school as the rich people. So there's connection. There's it's about information. So I think that if the US needs to review its policy in Haiti, because many Haitians think that the way that the country is being running now, it's a US policy. So the US wants Haiti to be like that. So if the US needs to review its policy in Haiti, it must start by questioning its people in Haiti. It must start by questioning its project in Haiti for decades. So the US has been spending, have spent, millions of dollars. I mean, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars the last, 30, 40 years in Haiti. So what is the result? If you're questioning the Haitian government, I think that you must start by questioning yourself. So the US must question its people, its representative in Haiti. The US must review the way, it makes policy, its interaction. I think the US politicians must be aware that racism is a big part of the way they treat Haiti politically. So I know that it's not an easy, it's not, an easy question. There is any easy answer to that question, because I think that as long as the US cannot solve internally its racism problem, the racist racism will pervade through its diplomacy. So if really the US wants to review its policy in Haiti, it must start by questioning itself in Haiti.
What I'll say is that this is a really good question, and this is a question that both Haitians and American policymakers should think about. And I would say that the US need to show more ambition and it's not creativity, but I don't know who is like influencing the US Haitian relations and the US policy towards Haiti, but they are not really doing a good job. And it's like they are treating Haiti as the country they knew from years ago, and they are not willing to understand that a lot of things is happening in Haiti. And this is why the US kind of neglected the social movement asking for accountability in Haiti, and they didn't really see in this new generation of activists and leaders an alternative, like new interlocutors at some point. And it's because I think there is a fixed idea of what is Haiti, who are the main actors, and I think there is a lot of hesitancy to move past this idea. But Haiti is changing, it's evolving. And this political crisis is one of the proof. You don't have, like, none of the traditional actors are able to impose a solution to the crisis. And this is the proof that a lot has changed. And the US need to understand that and show more ambition, see Haiti as a partner, not only a place where refugees are coming from and that they need to deal with. It's like, let's see what we can do to control the wave of migrants from Haiti. Let's see how we can try to promote democracy, but we're not really putting as much money as we could. We are not treating it as a priority. And I think they really need to rethink this and see in Haiti a partner, a true partner, see the potential. There are potential from both sides, and definitely need to understand that the Haitian actors that they used to deal with are not the same that they should continue dealing with. There is a shift, and until they realize this, they will keep promoting solutions that do not work. They will still receiving new wave of refugees and asylum seekers, because this is what happened when you are trying to influence policy in another country and it's not working. So they need to acknowledge that this is not working, the current policies are not working, and find new ways to interact with Haiti and change their policy toward Haiti.
Yeah, deal with new people.
Definitely.
Gabrielle, did you want to add to that question as well?
I won't add too much, but I think I think Emmanuela and Ralph are spot on. I mean, even the former envoy from the U.S. to Haiti, in his resignation letter, said things along these lines, that he acknowledged, Foote, how broken this policy has been, and how, there's one line that I'm not going to get right off the top of my head, but he basically said, the puppeteering, or the belief that we can continue to choose leaders for a country is just such a powerful example of hubris, acknowledging what has been done, right? And acknowledging that the US is still continuing to try to do that, instead of listen to organizations and things like the Commission for a Haitian Solution to the Crisis, and things that are Haitian-led and Haitian coalitions of hundreds of Haitian organizations who are coming together to try to come up with a solution on their own that is not engineered or puppeteered by the US or the core group. And so I think that that's everything they said is spot on, but it's even people within the US administration that are few, but some that are acknowledging that this is not working. And I think that needs to be acknowledged more widely.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Merci en pile. We're going to pause here. And I say pause because this is just really the start of a larger conversation. Hopefully, with yourself as you are trying to learn more about what's happening in Haiti, with your community as you press people to be more clear about how they engage with Haiti, with your schools, with your students, wherever the space is that you occupy. I'm hoping that this is the start of a larger conversation. So I'm going to say that we're going to pause here for today. And I want to thank Emmanuela, Gabrielle, Ralph. Thank you so much for your vulnerability, because I know that speaking on a public forum about a difficult conversation, it's not something that's easy. And you're actually putting yourselves on the line for a larger purpose. And I honor that, I respect that. And I want to thank everyone that joined us here on the Zoom and also on Facebook. Thank you so much to CLACS. Thank you to Omar. Thank you to Cynthia. Thank you to Dylan. Merci en pile. CLACS is always ready to use its platform to amplify the voices of people who are doing work on the ground. And I'm always here for that. My last question is this, and I always ask this because I think it's so important. How can we support you all directly? What do you need from us in this moment? What is your ask of the 76 people who are in this Zoom room? What is your ask of us?
Well, I'll say be an advocate for Haiti, believe in Haiti. And it is really important because there is an urge to portray Haiti as a failed state condemned to being a poor country, and it's wrong. We are not, there is no condemnation. It's just failure of like policies, and we can fix this. I would say be an advocate for Haiti, support the Haiti, and believe in Haiti.
I would say that people like you, people following us here, listening to us, um, you should guys amplify the positive vibes from Haiti, and you should understand that activism is part of the change. It's not just sending money and other items, but activism is part of the change. You should amplify the voice of people asking for change, denouncing corruption, um, claiming another leadership in Haiti. And another thing is to support materially the work of good organization in Haiti. And this is really important. I've said it many times because I've seen the dependency on foreign, international, aid in Haiti. I think that you Haitians, many people here, you can be part of that change by contributing, financially, materially, in the change.
Merci, Ralph.
The only thing I'll add is, as you all have all mentioned, and as history shows, unfortunately, U.S. policy towards Haitian migrants has been racist and draconian for a very long time. And unfortunately, I didn't think that kind of in my professional life that I would witness the type of crisis and the type of treatment that Haitians experienced. Unfortunately, I don't think at Del Rio, I don't think that will be the last time. And I think that everybody in here should be out in the streets and should be joining with the organizations who are going to fight against the draconian policies that are unfortunately likely to continue. And it was the Haitians and the allies who fought against Haitians being in Guantanamo, and Haitians, just the various ways that Haitians were oppressed in the past when it comes to migration policy. And we need to be ready to fight if that happens again.
Merci en pile, Gabrielle. Thank you all to everyone who is here. Oh, I always feel so full after conversations like this, but also like really ignited. Parce que gen pile bagay nous doit faire toujours. So thank you all so very much. I'm going to end the way I always end meetings, and which is by offering you all honneur and respect. And I hope that you all continue to walk with honneur, respect in all that you do. I know it can be challenging, but I also know that we accept that this is our responsibility as the great, great, great grandchildren of some truly amazing people, y'all. We come from amazing people. Never forget that. Pas jamblier côté nous sorti, ever, ever, because that's what's going to keep driving us forward. So, en pile honnête, en pile respect to you all. Gabrielle, Emmanuela, Ralph, thank you so much for the work that you do. C'est nous-mêmes nap suivre. We're following your steps, and we can't wait to see what's next. Thank you, everybody. Merci.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Merci, Apil.